will make other people's lives richer too. So, well, Fred, a great comrade, a great human being, and someone I'll always remember.
Yeah, my first meeting with Fred would have been about the same time. We shared a common interest in Philip Andrews, the heterodox price theorist, who was my first boss and one of Fred's first heroes, which was odd because Andrews was a right-wing conservative pro-business supporter.
Working class Tory.
Yeah. One thing I remember very much from this is the big pile of documents that arrived in the post for me from Fred, not soon after we became correspondent. Fred was a genuine socialist as an academic as well as a political activist. He thought that the development of knowledge was a public good, and instead of taking the Andrews, whoever it was, correspondence away, sitting on it and working on it for his own benefit for the rest of his life, he was very keen to share it, and I know he did that with other people. If you go to the Fredley website, which I think is still up and running, there's vast amounts of documentary evidence that he's responsible for placing there. He deserves to be remembered for that. He deserves to be remembered as a historian of heterodox economics, I think, and even though you might not agree with all the judgments in his books on heterodox economics, he did an awful amount of really serious and valuable empirical research. And those of you who are from England or were in England in the 1990s will remember the work that he did on the impact of the research assessment exercise on heterodox economics in the UK, which we've come to realise in Australia is going to have the same disastrous effect on heterodox economics here. And Fred stood out and resisted that, and I think deserves also to be remembered for that. His death depressed me horribly because he was 2.5 years younger than me, and you start to realise that you're mortal in fact. But as Jeff said, he influenced an awful lot of people, and he won't be forgotten.
Right, well, I was at an event in London about 3 weeks ago that was going to be a sort of fundraiser for Fred's scholarship fund for students, and do have a look and donate if you can. You know, Fred was a champion of students, and unfortunately it turned into a kind of memorial event. I first met Fred in 1993 at the Malvern Conference. I was 24 and I knew nothing. And you know, Fred always did make a beeline for the new young people who, you know, were coming into the profession. He was sort of very helpful, very encouraging. I think at that time he was working at De Montfort, and you know, De Montfort, they had this great idea to create a kind of pluralist program, but there were a lot of tensions with that. And so when I first met Fred, he struck me as quite anxious is maybe the wrong word, but he was quite angry about all these things that were happening, and probably a sort of righteous anger. I remember sitting, when I first met him, sitting at the conference dinner, and you know how it is with some conferences, the wine flows, and some you're just a bit worried that the wine might run out. And Fred was teetotal, and so I always knew to sit near Fred. There'd be more wine on the table, although the reason for him being teetotal was quite tragic in terms of one of his parents having been an alcoholic. And he was very open about that. Fred would just tell you, you know, things about his past, and you know, was very open. I always found him a very sort of warm man. And then I think obviously he went to the US, back to the US, And it was interesting to see him, that this kind of sort of anger dissipated, and you had a man that seemed really at peace with the world. He was in a university that valued him. He was surrounded by students and colleagues that valued him. And so, you know, that I think was very good for Fred. One of the things that I used to do, I coordinated the AHE, and I was involved with the Association for Heterodox Economics when it was formed, and Fred was quite instrumental in that. He was sort of mindful of the fact that the Royal Economic Society was no longer open for business vis-à-vis heterodox economists. And so what he did was he rung up the University of Nottingham, and when the RES was on, and booked some rooms. And perhaps it's an urban myth, but in fact this is how Fred relayed it. He was on the phone to them and they said, yeah, okay, and who's this booking for? And he said, on the spur of the moment, the Association for Heterodox Economics. So on the spur of the moment. And then of course she picked up the term. So it's like this sort of, I guess it's a path dependency. I don't understand these things. But this event sort of triggered and snowballed. We got ultimately the creation of the Association for Heterodox Economics, and then she, which of course picked up the term heterodox economics. And I think, and you now hear mainstream economists talking about heterodox economics, and I think this term, even though the term had been used previously, it entered the lexicon of us as a consequence of Fred's contribution. The funniest thing about that event was, if you imagine there were the great and the good of the Royal Economic Society, the caterers at Nottingham didn't realise we were separate. We got this marvellous lunch. So, and I think that was the thing that really pissed them off. So the next year, Fred ran, it was at the University of St Andrews, and he'd had this correspondence with Das Gupta, and this correspondence with Das Gupta, and Das Gupta had wrote back and said, oh no, we only have invited sessions that have real academic integrity with the Fred. In other words, your stuff's a load of old tat, was the tenor of what I was saying. And then Fred tried to ring up and book St Andrews. St Andrews said, oh no, we've got no rooms available that week. So they saw us coming, and with the result then the AHE moved to London and continued thereafter. And for me, at that time, I was incredibly isolated as a heterodox economist, aged 30 by then. You know, it introduced me to people, the people from Leeds, you know, it introduced me to people like Andrew Meerman, like Dave Spencer, Gary Slater, Dave Harvey, people my age or my generation who would actually begin to push heterodoxy forward, you know. We have to renew or die, was Fred's attitude. And he pushed young people to take the leadership and push this organisation forward. So those are some of my recollections of Fred. His death was tragic because he had a whole programme of things lined up to do. You know, 61.5, you think about all the things he could have done over the next 10 years, all the things he'd lined up to do. I think we've been really, really robbed. The irony is, of course, Fred rejects the foundation of economics on the basis of scarcity, but Fred's life ultimately was more scarce than would have been desirable. So, there you go.
Keep it together.
I'm not as old, unfortunately, as you guys, so I didn't know Fred for as long. but he was angry when I met him in 2006, and I think maybe that was because he was back in the UK. I don't know. Lots of the comments that have already been made I share, and I don't want to repeat them, but I want to reflect a little bit in terms of myself coming into academia after spending 20-odd years in the public sector. And Fred, because of his commitment to us as a community, how I think he influenced even my intellectual development when I was writing the thesis. And it was because he displayed to me a willingness and a generosity to debate ideas and for pluralism, and not to reject a particular, perhaps, tradition, but also the evolution in his own thinking over the years of his project, which is very similar to where I come from with my colleagues, my French regulationist colleagues, in terms of not being so blind and never to change my spots over time. He was ambitious, and I think he was ambitious for us as a heterodox community, and that, I think, was part of his anger to keep flailing us, to keep going on. Part of his legacy I'm going to be part of in early January, and the AFI conference in Boston. When Fred became president-elect, he immediately set forth on a very ambitious program for AFI this particular January. And it was ambitious because he literally whipped every AFI member to think about looking forward and to develop theoretical foundations, looking forward, not looking back. Because he was also annoyed and angry that people had been resting on their laurels to look back and not to look forward. It is an incredibly ambitious program, and I think I'm quite critical often of my American colleagues that I think their scholarship's a little more shallow than my European colleagues. But I think what the program will do will actually add some new depths to particularly institutional economics and related traditions. So I'm quite pleased that I will, well, I'm intending to partake in it, but I've got to go and finish writing a paper to turn up. The other thing I want to mention about sort of Fred's intellectual legacy is relating to this sort of what he called the false dichotomy of micro and macro. I mean, when I did my undergraduate degree, my first year I spent studying microeconomics, and I think it scarred me for life.
You took more than 20 minutes?
I mean, it was a very old-fashioned, traditional sort of way of being taught economics. But what Fred, in his own encouraging way, it wasn't about being right or wrong, but what he encouraged me and others to think about was not using that dichotomy, but also to think about what he kept calling the social provisioning process, and what that meant in terms of the social fabric, what that meant in terms of institutions, and presenting a theoretical approach that he was still developing at the time of his death, in terms of sort of three parts of structure, organisation and agency. And that is the one thing that I think I'll keep taking with me about what Fred's left behind in terms of his intellectual sort of legacy and what I can still work with. I don't have any jokes to make about Fred because I'm still pretty raw about his death. He was a good colleague and friend. I will tell you though, a few little personal aside was January this year in Philadelphia. He was less angry, but he said to me, "Lynn, don't get worried if in the session I have to sit down." He said, "I get a bit short of breath." Okay. He said, "I've been having all these tests, but they assure me it's not cancer." And he did get a bit short of breath, and he got very tired. Anyway, we were talking at the end of the session and said goodbye. And he was a very sort of private person, and I sort of get areas and throw masks around, kiss everyone and everything, but you know, it was always a little bit reserved with Fred. Anyway, we said goodbye, and I said, look, let us know how things go. And then get home, and I get an email, and he said, guess what, Lynn? They reckon I'm allergic to feathers. And then 3 weeks later, I'll get another email, you know, and I think that's a bit of an indictment of the health system he was living under. And he said to me, and this was Fred being very personal, he said, what do you think I should do? And I said, well, you've already got it mapped out. I mean, even at the time of his death, he was part of a clinical trial because he wanted people to learn and gain knowledge from what he was going through. And I said to him, well, when I was faced in a very similar situation, after only just returning to Sydney in 2010, I set goals. I had goals, but when I finished 6 months of chemotherapy, I went and did 4 international conferences. I had to have 4 papers done, and I had to be ready to go. I had to have all my results processed. I just had goals. And I said, you just keep living a normal life as much as you can. He was a lot sicker than I was, and the chemo did knock him around a lot more than it knocked me around. But he did, kept those goals, and unfortunately Ruth is now implementing a lot of those goals, like in terms of the scholarship fund and a few other things. I would hope that this annual conference we can continue developing the heterodox community as Fred did for us and supported us. And I think there are probably a number of ways that we can probably explore how we might do that. That's all I really want to.
It's 2 o'clock, so the session is going to start